I was teaching at the University of Rochester, which had one of the best kind of radical departments in the whole country at one point. But they argued all the time, and I didn't have any stake in arguments among white historians. Mike Delwell, who I knew, who was the chair here, I knew from Howard. We were freshmen together at Howard University in DC in 1959. Mike said, would I come to UMass to help him build a Black Studies program? And I said, okay, I'll come for a year and see what it looks like. And so I came in 1972 and I stayed. It wasn't a traditional academic department at all. It was a movement department. The people that were here when I got here were people that Mike had gathered from various parts of the civil rights movement. He had Julius Lester and Ivanhoe Donaldson, Cortland Cox out of SNCC. He had Sharif Galal, who fought with Frantz Fanon in Algeria. And when I came, it's one of those things you do whatever you want. It wasn't like, this is what we do. He says, this is the class, it's yours. And so I kind of enjoyed it. Also, the students were in total kind of uproar and chaos. And you had this tremendous amount and variety of activism of every political tendency you could possibly have. And I became the chair after 2 years because Mike could not stand all that stuff. Mike was Jamaican. And Mike had no interest at all in faction fights in Black communities. And it's a working class school. Not so much now, but it was then. First generation people, about 40% Irish, only about a 3 or 4% Black population, but it was the loudest, most raucous 3% you'd ever have on a campus. They had a whole building. They had most of the time on a radio station, and we kind of talk about that, but Black Mass Communication Project had about 75% of the radio time on WMUA, and they had additional time on WCFL. And so for a small population, it kind of set the tone on the campus. And you had white allies because you couldn't get Black people hired until some white people had hired them. So you had genuine kind of white allies, not people that wanted to tell you what to do, but people that supported independent Black kind of politics. And so I said I'd stay for a year, and then I ended up staying till almost 50 years now. Imagine when you walk into a department, Mike is telling me, and I thought he was joking. He said, yeah, I said, who else is coming? He said, oh, we got a lot of people coming in. We got Max Roach and Archie Shepp. And I said, yeah. I said, I already signed the contract. You don't have to BS me. Like I'm here already. You don't have to con me. And I'm putting books on the bookshelf, and I look out in the hallway, and walking down the hallway is Max Roach. Max, to me, was the greatest drummer that ever lived. And he is walking down the hallway, third floor New Africa House. And then you look around and you say, well, who's teaching writing? Well, you have General Achebe. Well, no, you're no better than that. You look up and down the hallway, you have a dancer, Diana Ramos. You have over in the School of Ed, you have Roland Wiggins, who was a brilliant musical education guy. He was so smart, nobody knew what he was talking about. You had Yusuf Lateef. You had Reggie Workman up on Orchard Hill living in the dorm. You had Marion Brown over at Amherst College. And then the next year you had Sonia Sanchez, who I knew about, but met for the first time, and we've been kind of buddies ever since. And so it's an atmosphere of brilliant, committed people. Mike had just, before I got here, they had maneuvered Randolph Bromley into the chancellorship as the first Black chancellor in the system anyway, and in fact, one of the first Black chancellors in the whole country. And so he supported everything we did, so you didn't have to worry about an administration stopping you. You just had to figure out how you get the resources. It's a great place to raise kids. The schools are good, even with the problems within the schools. I actually sued them once, for racial discrimination. And that's why they never invite me to get the commencement address at the high school. They're still mad about that. But my sister came after her husband died in Ohio. So she came and she taught in Amherst schools for many years, later became the principal. She brought my moms with me. So I had a family around, and I had movement people around. You had an active student body. We had a whole building, and everybody in the world that you ever wanted to meet or know came through here. You know, Walter Rodney, Angela Davis. So you had space to do movement work and academic work at the same time. Most of the department didn't have traditional academic kind of credentials like I didn't. I had a reputation as a historian, but I never finished grad school because I thought it was stupid. You know, when I was at Northwestern, nobody knew anything, and I was saying, like, why am I here? I started programs all over the Midwest, and I never looked for a job in my life. I know people always ask me, did I want to work? And so if the purpose of school was to get a job, then I had a job. Like, so what was the problem? And I had published with the people that everybody else wanted to study with. So I couldn't figure that one out. Like they said, well, you should be studying with somebody in school. And I said, well, that's the guys I'm writing books with. Like the people you are reading are people that treat me like an equal. And I was lucky in that regard. And so I never had a traditional academic career, but I published a lot. And, you know, I probably know more the history of Black people than anybody in the country still do. I did, but that was true 40 years ago. Because I'd been reading about Black people since I was about 10 years old. At Rochester, everybody was uniformly brilliant. They were all, you know, 4.0s and, you know, 1,600 board scores. They didn't need me. I couldn't add anything to their lives. But UMass was my kind of student. Loud, raucous, Malcolm X Center party every weekend. Turn the heat up to 75 degrees so you sweating, hitting the door, you know, charging $5 even though it's free, you know. Scamming the money, playing the music so loud the walls vibrated, you know, and that was like every weekend. They, you know, it was like they just rocked the place, and so you had an area where Black people were safe. The Latino kids started a New Africa House. Asian American kids started a New Africa House. Josephine White Eagle came, and the Native American kids started a New Africa House. So we helped everybody else get their space. We're unique in probably in most colleges anywhere in the country that early on we formed an alliance with women's studies. The first year I got here, second year I got here, Arlene Abakian, who was, and Dale Melcher out of women's studies asked me to give a talk in the intro to women's studies class about Ida B. Wells. And I said, well, you know, I really don't want to get in a big argument with white females because I'm really not into, you know, kind of white feminism. Like, you know, there's no Black people up in there. So like, I don't have much interest in it. You know, I've taught Black women my whole life. I've never taught a course I didn't talk about Black women. And so I thought I'd go there and give my regular talk, and they wouldn't want to bring me back anymore because I would tell them that white women are at the center of the universe, which I told them. And I said, well, that's that. And Ali said, that's really great. You got to do this every year because these little snots think that white women are the center of the universe. I said, okay. So we've had a close political relationship ever since. There are a couple of things I'm particularly proud of. People talk about that great essay by Chinua Achebe that started post-colonial, whatever. Well, the way Chinua got to give the chancellor's lecture was that Chancellor Bromley put me on the committee to pick these people. And I did not want to be on any committee to pick people to give a lecture about nothing. But if the chancellor, who's Black, asks you to do something, you do it. And why he put me on there was that they had a whole bunch of white people they were going to give these awards to. And I said, like, whoa, like, you got to get somebody up in there that looks like somebody other than y'all. And they said, who? So I said, well, how about Chinua Achebe? And they said, well, who is that? And I said, I brought along a resume just in case. And they said, oh, he seems pretty good. I said, I think so. You know, and that's when Chinua gave that talk, The Image of Africa, which people mark as the beginning of post-colonial studies and whatever. James Baldwin was on our faculty, but the way he had to get hired by somebody because we had gotten Jimmy a honorary degree. And then at the end of the event, we were all over at Paul Puryear's house, Black Provost, and drinking Johnny Walker Black Label, Jimmy's favorite, and everybody's drunk and making all kind of noise and laughing and playing and whatnot. And I just said, like, what are you doing? Why don't you come work with us? And he looked around, he said, like, whatever. I said, like, you got a job now? And he said, yeah, he's working at Bowling Green in Ohio. So, well, you know, well, how much are they paying? You know, he said, I'm getting $5,000 to teach a writing course. And the room went dead silent. And Jimmy looked at him and said, did I say something wrong? I said, we can get you more than $5,000, man. So the next day I called up the head of Five Colleges Incorporated, Pat Murphy, and said, Pat, we got to move fast. We can get James Baldwin. He's willing to come. He usually makes about 100,000, but we can get him for 75. So you got to move fast. This is like, this is like fast, real fast. And so within a day, they had got a commitment to pay James Baldwin $75,000. The biggest thing we ever did, the one that people are still talking about, was getting Toni Morrison and Sonia Sanchez and Bernice Reagan to come for one evening at the Mullen Center. And they set aside, I think, 400 seats for VIPs. And I gave all the band to the guys in the barbershop and Willie, who gives me parking tickets, and, regular Amherst folk. So they had the trustees and all the Congress people and all that kind of people with the local Amherst people, who all, in my view, were VIPs. It was an amazing event. And they just talked. They talked about what they did. Sonia being a poet, Bernice being a singer, and Toni Morrison just talked about being a writer. I mean, just amazing. Just the brilliance of it was just fantastic. People are still talking about that. And one of the most moving things recently was when Toni Morrison died a year ago, that every time Sonia would go see her when she was up in her, still up in upstate New York in her home, when she was very sick, and she would say, like, she's got to get better because she wants to come back to Amherst, because that was the best time she ever had, because people treated her right. And that's not a bad accomplishment, to have Toni Morrison say that she wanted to come back rather than go to Carnegie Hall or someplace like that. And so I'm still quite kind of proud of that one. The best thing I ever did for the department was to hire our secretary, Trish Loveland. When I was the head of the faculty senate, she was a junior secretary. I think she might have been, 19 or 20 years or something. I don't even know, but not much more than that. And she's one of the smartest people I ever met, except she was like a junior secretary. It took me about 2 weeks to realize that she's like really smart. But she grew up and tough and organized, and she grew up in the Upper Valley. So if she had grown up, say, 10 miles down, she'd have grown up in Amherst, she'd have gone to college. But in fact, she didn't. She grew up in Turner's Falls. And so they go to food trays. And so she came on the campus working in a dining hall. And then she got a job as a junior secretary, but she was like way, way, way smarter than that. So when I came back over after 5 years from the faculty senate, putting up with trying to run white people's business, I said, I'm getting something out of this. So I said, Trish, you want to come back and run our department? And she said, I never ran a department before. I said, it doesn't make any sense. You got more brains than anybody on the third floor in the Africa House. And she said, you kidding? I said, I wish I was kidding. And so I brought Trish back over, and within 2 days, she had revamped the whole office, which is to say, organized it for the first time. Throughout half the files, like, why are y'all keeping this stuff in this? I mean, she just swept through the place. And she's like, 20 years old. And if you ever met Trish, you know that she's the only indispensable person in our department. If you dropped a bomb on the building and all the faculty died, you could replace us all with an ad in the paper in about a week. And no replacement for Trish. If Trish walks away, the lights don't come on. Nobody know nothing about nothing, right? I mean, if you ever had any interaction with her, you know what I'm talking about. But this is one of the few campuses where Black faculty and Jewish faculty got along before crisis. So things don't blow up here because we call each other up. If somebody says something anti-Semitic in the class, they don't take it to the newspaper. Moriana called me up and say, talk to so-and-so, this is what they said, it's okay, I got it. Or if a Jewish kid says something racist, I say, Moriana, you gotta check this person, these kids are upset about that. And so you handle it. And that's what's unique about this campus is you can make those kind of contacts with principal people that could work through differences without the whole campus kind of blowing up. And I like those kinds of moments. And I was the head of the faculty senate for 5 years because the white faculty were afraid of the new chancellor, which is what they told me. And I'm saying, like, why are you all afraid of him? They said, well, he's the chancellor. I've been shot at by the police. The chancellor don't mean nothing to me, but I'll do it. But I did it so we could get our graduate program because they had not approved our graduate program. And the only reason I took the job was to go over and find out what was happening with our graduate program. And when I got there, I asked about it, and Trish and the other secretary, Sherry, said, "Oh, it's over there in the corner." And they had our program, all our documents in a box sitting in the corner of the faculty senate office. And I said, "Like, what's that all about?" He said, "Well, they're afraid to put it on the agenda because if they didn't like it, you come and we get mad at them." I said, "That's pathetic." So I held up all the undergraduate programs until they passed ours, because I was the one that set the agenda as the secretary of the faculty senate, so they could solve that problem. The governor, when Michael Dukakis was running for office, he people didn't like him a lot, but he was the governor. And he said he was going to come to campus to visit UMass, right? And he announced that he was going to come to our department to visit one of our classes. He didn't ask him about it. He just said this, that he wanted to visit a class on civil rights taught by Julius Lester. And I was the department head. So I wrote it back. I said, "This is not, the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany where the political people just walk into people's classes." I said, "You are welcome to come, but I'm going to consult with Professor Lester to see if it's okay." So he came to campus. Wintertime, because it's snow outside. And of course, all the white kids didn't like him, so they're throwing snowballs at the governor, right, in front of New Africa House. So he comes in to meet with us after Julius's class for about maybe 10 minutes. He said he could stay a few minutes, and he sat down, and we started talking about the university, and he kept asking me what I wanted. I said, "Oh, anything." I said, if you give money to UMass, then we'll get out. You're not going to be able to say that I asked you for anything. I'm not going to ask you for anything. He said, "Why do we need UMass if you have Harvard and MIT and all these wonderful private schools?" And I said, "Because everybody can't afford to go to those places." I said, "This is a first-rate school, and we do things here that those places can't do, and the people that come here are people that couldn't get in those places and couldn't afford anyway, and they're going to stay in Massachusetts. The Harvard graduates don't stay in Massachusetts, they go all around the world. So you want people that are from here, that will work here and build up the Commonwealth, and you ought to support that." And so he hadn't thought about it that way. And he said every other department he talked to, people asked for money for their department budget. I said, "I'm not going to do that. No, that doesn't work. That means you can give me money, somebody else can take it away." I said, "No, you fund the university, I can get it. Once it gets into the system, we'll get our share. But the system has to work. I don't want to be the only department standing in a university that's falling apart." I said, "Like, what kind of university would that be?" And Paul Park said, "What kind of politician are you?" I said, "Look, I spent 10 years in Chicago. I know better than to get me a line out of no budget where y'all can go through the budget and X me out. Like, I ain't stupid." And he kind of smiled and said, "Yeah, you're right." I said, "Yeah, I know, man." When I was 19, I wanted to make a world where Black people could walk free and equal and not be looked down upon and have all the resources they need. And that's what I spent most of my life doing. And that's what I care most about. And every environment I go into, that's the first thing I notice. Black people aren't getting their fair due. That's what I write about. This is not an isolated area. This area was key to the Underground Railroads. It's where John Brown met Sojourner Truth, right over there in Florence. Du Bois's uncle ran a tailor shop here in Amherst. That's where he got his first suit when he graduated from high school. And it's a very important place. This is a very interesting political area for Black people that goes back to the middle of the 19th century. And so you're not alone. You're not away from a Black population. It's just a different Black population. And so there's plenty of work to do. So that's why you stay. There's work to do, and there's good people. You got space, fresh air and all.